Good morning all at St James and St Luke's. My name is Emily and I'm the Church Relationship Manager in the north of England for Open Doors. And we serve persecuted Christians around the world. But also my role here in the UK is to share some testimony of what God is doing amongst the churches in the UK for our encouragement, so that we can stand with our prayers and our support our persecuted family around the world. Don't know how you're feeling as we enter this next week of lockdown, but I've certainly been asking the question, is my life just on hold? Is this lockdown just a pause button? Or has God got any purpose for me in this time? Because I don't know about you, but I had plans, I had events that I wanted to attend, I had family celebrations that were going to happen, which have had to be cancelled or postponed. And it's frustrating. And I can feel like, why all my plans and hopes for 2020 seem to involve people and travel, and I can't do any of those. But the testimony we hear from our persecuted family is that God is still working even when things aren't going to our plan. This week, as I've been praying, I was just reminded of Psalm 62, particularly those middle verses where it says, "Yes, my soul, find rest in God. My hope comes from him. Truly he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will not be shaken." And I need to speak that to my soul this week as we enter another week of lockdown. Yes, my soul, find rest in God. But also through my role and through my job, I hear stories of how God is working amongst our persecuted family. And now they know that's a sense of isolation, albeit for a very different reason, for persecution for their faith. But there's something that we can learn from in our isolation from the virus, from these guys' testimony. And so I wanted to share 3 stories from believers who have met God deeply in times of persecution. And the first is from a gentleman called Wang Mingdao. Now he is known more commonly now as one of the great revivalists from China. But in 1955, he was sentenced to 22.5 years in prison. And he was given a get out of jail option. He was told that he could sign away like a confession to say that he isn't a Christian, he isn't a believer, to relinquish his faith and say that and promise that he wouldn't speak more about Jesus. And in his mind, he felt this calling towards preaching and evangelizing. And he was like, you know what? I could sign this document and I could leave, walk away from here a free man, and I can continue to talk about Jesus, just the state won't know about it. And so that's what he did. He signed this document and he was let free. But as he walked away, he just felt the weight of what he'd done and knew he'd made the wrong decision. So he turned around and went back inside and said, "Rip up that confession, rip it up. I will not stop following Jesus." And so he was sort of incarcerated, and he spent 22.5 years in prison. Many of those years he spent in solitary confinement, totally alone in his cell. But even during those times, that time of solitary confinement, he found a way to speak. Because in the corner of his cell, there was his toilet, which was a pipe in the ground. And that pipe didn't just come into his cell. It connected between all the different cells. And he worked out that if he spoke down that pipe, it echoed throughout all the other cells. And so he used to preach into that pipe. He turned that pit into his pulpit, and he saw over 96 people give their lives to Jesus through his time in solitary confinement. I'm just so encouraged. God used him even in that period of confinement. And Mingdao, he doesn't say that he could have reached more people had he been free, although that possibly might be true. Instead, about his incarceration, he says that those 20 years in prison, those 20 years were the best years for my relationship with God. They were his best years. So my encouragement to you this morning is, as we have this time in lockdown, get to know Jesus. Spend time with him. because we might find that this is some of the best time for our relationship with God, to get to know him. My second testimony comes from a woman in the modern day living in the Middle East. I'm going to call her Rachel. That's not her real name, but Rachel, she became a believer with her husband when they were invited to a secret church. And they gave their lives wholeheartedly to Jesus. They studied the Bible and spent time in worship and prayer with other believers. And over time, their house church multiplied, and they found themselves leading one of their house churches. And Rachel says she knew that there was danger being a believer in her nation. She knew that the authorities watched secret churches and tried to quash them because they were deemed dangerous to the state. But she said she also tempered that with knowing God's promises about protection. Her and her family of believers didn't sort of flout their faith in front of the police. They would take precautions, so they used to speak over payphones in public rather than using their own traceable mobiles. And she told her daughter, who was 9 at the time, not to speak about church at school for fear that maybe a teacher or somebody would overhear and then report them to authorities. However, one morning when her husband and daughter were out on the school run, there was a knock at the front door and the police were there. They arrested Rachel and they took her away. She wasn't able to speak to anyone. She didn't know where she'd gone. She had no idea what had happened, if anything had happened to her husband and daughter. She was put into solitary confinement and initially was given no food. She had absolutely no contact with the outside world. And while she was there, she really wrestled with her faith, with this disappointment that God had promised to protect her, yet here she was in prison. And she said she was really frustrated at God. She didn't speak to him for days. But then one night as she slept, she had a dream. And in that dream, she heard the verses from John. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. And as she woke up the following day, she said her faith was renewed. She knew that although this earth was God's, that those in the world were not recognizing him. And she said she poured her heart out in prayer to Jesus. And she found herself a month later released from her incarceration and returned to her family. And again, she talks about that time in prison as a time where she learned to really trust God. She said she trusts God far more. She is a changed person because of her time in prison. And she says she's more passionate. She sees the value far more in speaking to her children about her faith. And so if you are feeling that sense of disappointment with where life is at the moment, of the things that you've missed, they might not, you might recognize they're not big important things they may be very first world problems, as we say. They might not be life or death situations, but they do raise disappointment in you. Take them to God, because God is interested in your heart, and if it is bringing disappointment, then please speak to him about it. Share your disappointments. God can handle them, even if they seem, or if you think that they are petty. God wants to hear your heart, and because he can handle your disappointment and be your encourager. So let us spend time with God. Let us take our disappointments to him. And finally, I want to tell you about Rohan, who became a believer when he was a teenager in India. And him and his family and 3 other families would gather together for worship. They were the only believers in their village. And the village, for the most part, let them be. They managed to save some money and they built a small church where they could gather to worship. But then one day, although the villagers mostly were tolerant of them, rumours had been circulating and somebody came and burnt their church down, told them that they couldn't worship anymore. And Rohan and the church there, they'd lost everything. They lost all their church. And it would have been really easy for Rohan to be disheartened. It'd be really easy for him. And I think they even thought about leaving the area. Perhaps it was becoming too dangerous. But Rohan said at no point did he feel overwhelmed. He knew that in this time God had something to teach him. And so he wanted to step into that, and he sought the wisdom of the other pastors around him, and they were praying for him. He got in touch, put in contact with our Open Doors representatives also. They're able to support him, and they were able to help finance a rebuilding of the church. And since through this time of the church burning down and then being rebuilt, Rowan has seen that church family grow, double in fact, in numbers. Rohan says that he never felt overwhelmed because he knew that Jesus had overcome the world. And those verses in John where it says, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, for I have overcome the world." Let us remember that passage. Jesus talking about his trial, his upcoming crucifixion and resurrection. But in all uncertainty, we can remember that today. Jesus has overcome the world. So these are just 3 incredible testimonies of our family who have encountered Jesus in the face of extreme persecution. And I hope that wherever you're at this morning, that you can take a moment to encounter Jesus where you are. Use that Psalm 62, to speak to your soul, to meet with God. And in a moment, we'll gather back together to pray for some of our persecuted family.